Yes, good morning, dear ladies and gentlemen, both here at the famous Cosmos Club in Washington, D.C., as well as to all our participants from the United States and from Europe joining us via Zoom this morning. A very warm welcome to our first in-person event about this very timely and important topic, trade, after such a long pause due to COVID. We are here today to open our second KAS, AICGS Transatlantic Trade Week, and this time under the banner Trade in a New Geoeconomic Era. For this week, we have organized two seminars, the one today, which is also broadcast live, and a more traditional one. That's funny to say, call these online events already traditional online, an online only event, I should say, on Thursday. We hope to see all of you again, but next time on Thursday via Zoom, when we will discuss trade and security. This Transatlantic Trade Week is jointly hosted by the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, or Konrad Adenauer Foundation in English, and the American Institute of Contemporary German Studies at Johns Hopkins University. Most of you know me, but just in case, after so much time, I'm Paul Linnartz. I'm head of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung Office for the United States, located here in Washington, D.C. Today's topic is about trade and values, and we have an impressive group of experts here to discuss how trading partners seek to achieve a more equitable economic growth through trade. Today's conflicts are not only about trade, but also about politics, of course, economic systems, culture, and values. And as David Brooks described in a recent opinion piece, we in the West subscribe to a series of universal values about freedom, democracy, and personal dignity. The problem is that these universal values are not universally accepted and seem to be getting less so, end of quote. For many decades, trade was regarded as a binding force among trading partners, a way to bridge differences and even bring nations closer together. But the devastating war in Ukraine is, of course, a wake-up call. And as some commentators, for example, at Bloomberg, have written, the war is, quote, again, is burying most of the basic assumptions that have underlain business thinking about the world for the past 40 years, end of quote. And that they have asserted that, again, quote, geopolitics is definitely moving against globalization toward a world dominated by two or three great trading blocks, end of quote. Today, dear ladies and gentlemen, trade and values are at the very center of our discussion. Germany has assumed the G7 presidency at the start of this year under the motto Progress Towards an Equitable World. Also, the Transatlantic Trade and Technology Council, which meets this weekend in France, close to Paris, offers opportunities to foster closer transatlantic cooperation. I'm glad to have such distinctive experts on the panel, and among the participants on the occasion of the Transatlantic Trade Week, we are fortunate to have one distinguished member of the European Parliament among us, unfortunately, though not here in DC, as we had planned for. Daniel Caspary, who we all recognize and know as a strong spokesman on international trade and who is on the panel today, unfortunately couldn't make it on short notice due to, yes, you can guess, due to COVID. We are very happy and honored, though, that he is going to join us today instead via Zoom. This is, of course, the second best option, and we all very much hope, dear Mr. Kaspari, that we are going to meet you in person soonest here in Washington, D.C. But before we get started, dear ladies and gentlemen, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to Jeff Raske, President of the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies, for his excellent cooperation and strong leadership. Thank you so much, Jeff. I also want to take this opportunity to sincerely thank Peter Rashish, Senior Fellow and Director of the Geoeconomics Program at AICGS. Today, Peter will lead us through the discussions on how the United States, Germany, and the European Union can help shape a more equitable international economic system that is more effective in responding to disruptive economic behavior. I'm very much looking forward to this important and timely exchange. Dear Jeff, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Paul. It is a great pleasure for us to collaborate with the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, not only on this event, but throughout the year. So thank you for your partnership and the excellent cooperation between our two organizations. I don't really want to add much to what you've said because I think you've set the stage, and I'm sure everyone is anxious to hear from our distinguished speakers. So I will just say one sentence, and that is, we see, with greater clarity than we have for many years, the ways in which our economic and trade policies have to be synchronized and coordinated with the big political problems of our day. We see it in Ukraine, where a brutal war is ongoing, and we see it elsewhere. So I think that it underscores the gravity and importance of these issues. And with that, let me hand the mic to Peter Rashish to take us through.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Paul. Let me add my welcome to all of you here, and my thanks to the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung for our cooperation on Transatlantic Trade Week. This is actually the second iteration of Transatlantic Trade Week. Last year in June, we had some virtual events which looked at China, at the WTO, and at trade and climate. And as has been said, in the months since, the US and the European Union have launched the Trade and Technology Council, as well as a joint effort to find a joint approach to steel and aluminum imports that accounts for their impact on the climate. And of course, as Jeff mentioned, we've also witnessed Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine, as well as a decision by the G7 and the EU shortly after to revoke Russia's most favored nation trading status in response. I think one common denominator, at least in these actions, is the desire to draw on trade policy to advance common transatlantic values, whether that is the concern to protect the environment or economic practices that put the state before the individual, violations of the international order, as we've seen with Russia's actions, or respecting human rights and human dignity in the ways we regulate supply chains or artificial intelligence, for example. You have the bios of our speakers, so let me just introduce them very briefly before we get started. Daniel Caspary is a German member of the European Parliament for Baden-Württemberg from the Christian Democratic Union, which is part of the European People's Party in the Parliament. He was elected chairman of the German CDU-CSU delegation in the European Parliament in July 2017 and has been deputy chairman of the CDU in Baden-Württemberg since 2017. Jennifer Hillman on my left is a professor of practice, co-director of the Center on Inclusive Trade and Development, and a fellow of the Institute of International Economic Law at Georgetown University Law Center. She has served as a member of the World Trade Organization's appellate body, as a commissioner at the U.S. International Trade Commission, and as general counsel and chief textiles negotiator at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. Dan Price, to my right, is managing director of Rock Creek Global Advisors, an international economic policy advisory firm. Previously, he served as in the George W. Bush administration as the senior White House official responsible for international trade and investment, and was the president's personal representative to the G8, the G20, and the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum. He was also U.S. chair of cabinet level economic dialogues with Brazil, India, and the European Union. Finally, Bill Reinsch, to my left, holds the Scholl Chair in International Business at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and is a senior advisor at Kelly, Dry & Warren. Previously, he served as president of the National Foreign Trade Council and at the same time as a member of the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. In addition to his role at CSIS, he is adjunct assistant professor at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy, and he earlier served as Undersecretary of Commerce for Export Administration during the Clinton administration. I'm going to hand it over to Jennifer Hillman first. Let me just remind you that after the panelists have provided their remarks and we open it up to conversation, please try to use one of the microphones. That'll, I think, help everybody here and elsewhere to understand and to participate. So with that, Oh, excuse me. That shows the perils of Zoom when you don't, when you pay attention to your in-person guests. No, Jennifer, thank you for correcting me. We're of course delighted to turn the floor over virtually to Daniel Caspary and look forward to his opening remarks. Please.
I'm so sorry I had to decide not to travel yesterday out of the following reasons. You have to know, last week, we had the first session week of the European Parliament without any COVID measures, no masks, no distances, nothing, and about 3,000 people around in our building. And now you could imagine of how many new COVID cases I learned over the weekend, including many colleagues and even staffers of my own office I had several close contacts with. In addition, I had positive tests in my family environment over the weekend, and having had negative tests yesterday, but not feeling 100% well, I decided not to bring you in danger and, frankly speaking, not getting into the situation of perhaps quarantine myself in the United States. And therefore, Zoom is not perfect, but definitely better than nothing. So what are my main messages today? First, Russia's unacceptable and illegal invasion of Ukraine represents a threat to security and economic stability. In Europe, in the United States, and across the world, it will have geopolitical implications within the next decades. Not only short-term, but within the next decades. As I have been working on the European Parliament's Trade Committee for more than 15 years, I now see a very big chance for closer relations with our existing partners, but also with new ones. A deepened transatlantic relationship should be the backbone and could deliver worldwide leadership. Our joint sanctions are tough and clear, and every country on the world should know that we will remember on both sides of the Atlantic who is part of our team or who is part of Putin's camp. President von der Leyen and Executive Vice President Dombrovskis, he is our responsible trade commissioner, are convinced supporters of stronger transatlantic relations. In the European Parliament, we should have majorities for that, I'm very sure. And the Transatlantic Legislators Dialogue, which is an institution between the European Parliament and the US Congress, it should be widened up to a transatlantic joint parliamentary assembly. So what does this mean in practice for the EU-US trade relations? Let's take the chance and improve our relations. In the last weeks and months, even from the election of President Trump now 5.5 years ago, many opponents of a TTIP in the past now stay quiet. Many of them will never say that publicly, but some of them feel they made a big mistake fighting against this project. I do not call out for a new huge trade and investment agreement, but we should gain momentum and quickly solve one dispute after the other as we did it during the last months and start new joint projects. We already did a lot. We delivered on the Airbus-Boeing dispute, we found a consensus on taxation of digital economy, and we found an interim solution to our steel and aluminum trade disputes. Now the Trade and Technology Council has to deliver, for instance, rules and standards for new technologies, including artificial intelligence. And together, I'm really sure we still have the power to set the global standards and to make sure that the global standard is not set in Beijing. We could coordinate to making our supply chains more stress resistant, because we know many companies have production on both sides of the Atlantic and face similar challenges. We should open our doors and make offers to possible new partners to help them getting less dependent from Russia or China and to help them integrating into the global world of trade. I especially look into the ASEAN and Southeast Asian region. We have to work closely on the issues of energy prices and local and global food supply. I don't have to tell you that moving away from Russian gas will clearly and visibly and toughly set up the gas prices within the European Union, not only on the short run, but for the next decades, and that will bring us big new challenges. And We have to better coordinate our bilateral negotiations with third countries. We should enhance our efforts to keep up the rule of law and the rules of international contracts on the global level. For instance, also having Jennifer with us today, we now really have to cooperate, keeping up the ideas of the bilateral trade system. On his trip to the United States, our Executive Vice President of the European Commission, Valdis Dombrovskis, was very clear on that only a few weeks ago. I quote from one of his speeches he gave: "The EU shares the EU's concerns about the functioning of the WTO, and we share the urgent need to address unfair trade practices emanating from non-market economies. These challenges include massive industrial subsidies, forced technology transfers, subsidization on home markets and third country markets, state involvement pervading across the entire economy, and aggressive industrial policies designed to build dominance without an account of costs." Quote end. But for us on the European side, on the Atlantic, it is clear. Multilateral trade delivered a lot during the last decade, so we need to improve and not to block the WTO. Here, the European Union showed much flexibility during the last months. I hope we could improve our cooperation at the WTO ministerial, which will take place very soon as well. So what to conclude? For the majority of citizens and decision makers in Europe, the transatlantic relationship is key. It is a backbone for economic and military success and security. The von der Leyen Commission has a big interest in improving transatlantic relations and has a backing majority in the European Parliament. So let's deliver on that. In the European Parliament, there are strong forces to improve our parliamentary cooperation from the TLD into a joint parliamentary assembly, and we now also have the backing of our new president, Roberta Metsola. It would be helpful if you could ask your contacts on the Hill for support for such a project. And we have to stay together and then still are in a strong position to help Ukraine in these difficult times and to successfully face future Russian, Chinese, and other challenges. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Kaspary, and thanks again for your flexibility and your commitment to joining us today via Zoom at short notice. Let me now turn the floor over to Bill Reinsch.
Okay, good. Well, thank you for having me, Peter and Jeff. It's a pleasure to be here. I think I'm going to make some comments, kind of go across the board, and hopefully that will lead into a good discussion. Some of them are about practical issues and some of them are about issues of principle. I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine has changed a lot of things, but it hasn't changed everything. It's brought the US and Europe closer together in some important ways that I think we'll be discussing, but it's clearly not resolved all the issues that have divided us for years. We'll see later this week how the TTC tackles some of those issues and which ones they choose to tackle. Our expectations right now is that it will be long on happy talk and short on actual deliverables, but we will see. Let me make a few comments starting where I think cooperation is easiest, and then moving on to areas where I think it's going to be more difficult. Clearly, I think anything related to mutual security in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine is an area where we've already seen remarkably close cooperation. And as someone who used to be in the export control business when I was in the government, what's happened just in the space of a couple of months in that area and on sanctions is something that just could never have happened even 2 years ago, even 1 year ago. So it's been remarkable. I would expect that to continue, certainly as long as the war continues, and probably after that with respect to Russia. I think the question that we ultimately have to address is the extent to which that cooperation can be translated outside the context of Ukraine and Russia. More specifically, what happens when the United States decides that it wants to take a similar approach to China, either in the event of a Taiwan invasion, or if it simply wants to have tougher export controls on technology transfers to China. How will the EU respond to that? And will the same level of cooperation continue there that we've seen with respect to Russia. Likewise, what about investment reviews, an area where we seem to be working together? How far, though, as a practical matter, how far a country is going to be willing to go to share proprietary information and to agree to make decisions in concert? It's one thing to say, as the TTC has said, we're going to cooperate. In a lot of these areas, that's kind of an elastic concept. Cooperation could mean we meet 3 or 4 times a year and talk about what's going on. Cooperation could also mean, in the case of export controls, we get together and actually review each other's license applications and can veto them. In other words, we go back to COCOM. No one's proposing that, but I raise it as when you say the word cooperation, that leaves a lot of territory that, we can end up in very different places. So I think we have to think about how far we want to go in cooperating and what's realistic. I think another area where it's likely to see more cooperation up to a point is on supply chains, early warning systems, and trying to find ways to work out the kinks before they become economically crippling. But again, this is an area where generalized commitments are easy. At the end, the key questions are going to be how much information each of us are prepared to share or legally able to share with the others, how much we can legally obtain from our private companies, and then pass on to others. And so I think those are unanswered questions at this point, but sooner or later, we have to get beyond the general and get into what the specifics of what cooperation actually means. Likewise, on things like in high tech, like semiconductor supply chains and chip spending packages, where both the EU and the US are moving in very much the same direction. I think the issue there ends up being how do we avoid redundancy and how do we complement each other rather than conflict with each other. And that will depend, I think, in many respects on how to determine the EU is to create an indigenous supply chain in that sector from beginning to end. And also how willing the US is to accept EU leadership in some parts of basically a Western supply chain, Western including Japan and Korea in this context. So there's a lot of, again, practical questions of how you implement these things. Where I think cooperation is more difficult, not impossible, but more difficult is on climate policy. Jennifer is going to say more about that. So I'll just say a couple of things about that briefly. Here we share the same goals, I think, sharp emissions reductions, climate mitigation policies. I think the one dilemma is the political conversation in the United States is far behind the political conversation in Europe, and how we catch up and how Europe encourages us to catch up in a way that actually moves the ball forward rather than ends up in us accusing each other of protectionism remains to be seen. We have not seen a lot of progress so far on the global arrangement on sustainable steel and aluminum. We've not seen much progress within the TTC and Working Group 2. We haven't seen much progress in the United States on border adjustment mechanisms, although certainly European actions have created a conversation here, which is a good thing. But how we move on from there is kind of an open question. And I could spell out scenarios, but I'll save time and leave that to Jennifer, and we can talk about that later. I think the other thing that's missing where cooperation is important is we need to figure out how to, if you will, operationalize our common climate goals by agreeing on a common way of counting embedded carbon. This is not about a price. This is not about the policy. It's simply about a way of determining how much carbon is in your ton of steel or your ton of aluminum or your semiconductor chip, whatever it is. If we all do it differently, then we are going down a road to endless argument, litigation, and debate. So that's something that we can probably work on with, I think, with good faith. There's also the remaining question about an issue that's getting more currency recently, particularly including yesterday, about a peace clause for green subsidies. If that means we're simply not going to sue each other in the WTO, good, that's fine. If it implies that we are going to decide not to take domestic legal recourse against each other for injurious subsidies, that, at least in the United States, would require legislation, which would require Congress, which makes it a lot more complicated. So you have to think there again about what cooperation means, sort of a theme here that's developing. Likewise, on digital regulation, I think both parties want mutually beneficial outcomes. Our approaches have not been coordinated thus far. The EU has been quick to act unilaterally, although their process is not short, neither is ours. It's probably a good thing. The US so far has failed to act in most digital areas. Our politics make doing so difficult, even though there's some common ground, at least in theory, on addressing some of the problems. The result is that EU regulations are becoming the default position, which I think is not good for American companies and which may get in the way of a future cooperation. There is, when it comes to sort of shared values on that question, there is some evolution going on in the United States, and Jennifer might want to comment on this in terms of rethinking about antitrust and competition policy. And I think in general, you've got a growing number of people in the United States that are moving in the direction of Europe in terms of analyzing those problems the same way that Europe analyzes them. This is a slow process. It's an uncertain one. It's 2 steps forward, 1 step backward. I think the people that want to keep analyzing these issues the same way that we've been analyzing them for the last 70 years or so want to continue doing that. But at least it's an alive issue, and it's one where I think that we could have a good dialogue, a constructive dialogue with Europe on how to approach competition and what trying to defend competition actually means in practical terms. And we haven't, we've mostly lobbed grenades at each other over that. I think on that point, I just would say I can see a couple, or actually, I think 3 areas that are kind of sort of fundamental differences of principle that may get in the way that we also are going to need to tackle as we go ahead, and then I'll stop. One, I think we still have differing long-term approaches to China. I think that the attitudes about China in Europe are evolving. And they're evolving in the direction of the United States. But I think this is a case, it's the reverse of digital regulation. I think this is a case where the United States has been ahead of Europe in understanding the nature of the problem and attempting to deal with it. But we still have to sort out the fact there are differences. I think second, Europe ultimately has to decide what strategic autonomy means. I mean, they have to have the same definition for everybody. Every European I talk to approaches that problem slightly differently. And I won't elaborate on that, but I think we have to sort that out. And finally, what has bedeviled us for 40 years continues, including on the areas where I've been describing, which is we have fundamentally different approaches to how we regulate behavior. To oversimplify, basically the European approach tends to be ex ante and prescriptive, and the US approach tends to be ex post and descriptive. And that has gotten in the way for literally 40 years of trying to resolve a whole bunch of problems from the mundane, chickens is my personal favorite, to ones that are much more sophisticated. We all agree on the outcome, we all agree on the values, we all agree that health, safety, and environmental protection are important. We can't seem to agree on how to get there, or even getting there, how we can get there via different paths. So having said all that, I just close by saying solving those problems is really important, not just to improve the relationship transatlantically, but also because if we can't, we face a more fragmented world trading system. We face the breakdown of the rules-based trading system. We face digital splintering, which we're already seeing anyway. And we face reduced supply chain security and resiliency. So the stakes really are high. And I hope that the mechanisms that we've started, beginning with TTC, are going to make some progress with some of these points.
Thank you. Jennifer.
Well, thank you very much. And it's a privilege to be here. So thank you for including me. And I would say a privilege to follow Bill Reinsch, who I think did set out, a really significant number of the issues where we need to see a lot of progress. I'm going to take this time to pick just one issue where I do think it fits very well under this umbrella of shared values between the United States and the European Union and drill into it. And that is the issue of climate change. because I think this is one of the areas where there is both huge promise as well as huge risks for transatlantic cooperation and or transatlantic divides. I mean, it's very clear to me that we simply cannot get to the scale and the speed that we need to fight climate change unless we marry together trade policy and climate policy. We just can't move fast enough without the two sort of policy arms working together. Again, to me, the huge potential lies from the fact that the US and the EU are both committed. I mean, we're clearly both on track to say we're going to get to net zero emissions by 2050. We have both made significant strides in reducing emissions over the past decade or so. In the United States, you've seen annual domestic greenhouse gas emissions fall by 13% since 2005. But I would say the EU as a bloc has gone much further, much faster. I mean, greenhouse gases emissions in the EU are down more like 31% between 1990 and 2020. So different years, but nonetheless. But clearly both sides are committed. And you look at that, you think renewable energy. Clearly the EU and the United States both share this. The EU, again, has gone further, faster. But we're not that far apart. I mean, 22.1% of gross final energy consumption in the European Union is now from renewables. The United States were less than 20%, but that is still the fastest growing area of energy production and consumption in the United States. The problem for us, obviously, in this space is also what the war in Ukraine has done. There's just no question there are now huge pressures on both sides of the Atlantic to at least, as they say, temporarily increase shipments of liquid natural gas, which means unequivocally building more LNG terminals, both in the United States, in order to, again, freeze down that gas and put it on a boat and ship it over to Europe. And it is going to require significant new investments within the European Union to build the LNG terminals on the other end, to unfreeze the gas and put it out into the European economy. And the question comes, what do you mean temporary? I mean, most of these facilities, if we're going to seriously build the kind of infrastructure that we need, no one is going to build those facilities with the notion that they're only going to be around for 10 or 15 years. That just simply does not make economic sense. So it clearly is going to mean some significant locking in of both the US and the European Union to continued and increased use of LNG. And yes, gas is less of a climate change problem than oil or coal. So it is better, but let's be very clear. It remains a fossil fuel. It remains a significant contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. And so again, it's one of these worrying trends. So I'm going to talk about three of the issues in the climate change space that I think are, again, these opportunities for both cooperation and significant potentials for disagreement. And I'm going to start with carbon pricing, because this is the one where right now we are just not aligned. I mean, it's clear that the major way in which the European Union is choosing to decarbonize is through a combination of carbon pricing in the form of an emissions trading system and significant regulation. The United States is going a very different direction, where we are choosing to do most of our decarbonization through deregulation and subsidies, and not at all going down, at least so far, the carbon pricing road. And obviously, this is one of the ones where there is a great potential for disagreement and a great need for cooperation to figure out whether or not the European system can recognize and take on board what the United States is doing in the regulation area, or vice versa. Because obviously, again, we see the European Union with its ETS system now getting ready to bring on board a carbon border adjustment mechanism. And I should be very clear, I commend and applaud the European Union for doing it. And one of the things that I would say to the European Union is do not exempt the United States from it, because it is the EU's CBAM that is going to push the United States and others to at least think about where we are going in any way, in sort of a comparable way. To me, the European Union has done a commendable job in working to make its CBAM come within the legitimate rules of the WTO. I mean, there's a huge effort, first of all, to start out with a transition period. So we're going to have 2 years of scoping it out, of collecting data, of thinking about how it's going to work before it kicks in 2026. The European Union has moved a long way to limit the number of sectors that are involved right from the get-go, limiting it to aluminum, iron, steel, fertilizers, cement. So again, a limited scope of industries. which I think is a good and a bad. What it has said in part on the United States side, I think you've seen not very much reaction to the fact that the CBAM is coming. To some degree, that may be some in the United States that don't really believe it's coming. I think that is a false thing to believe. I think there's no question that the European CBAM is coming. It is going to happen. But I think some of the muted reaction on this side is because very few American products are going to be caught up in it. So if you just do the math, there just simply isn't a whole lot of U.S. trade that is going to be affected by the CBAM right out of the box, unless, and here's the big unless, what the European Parliament is looking at doing, and again, I think in many ways very commendably, is to move beyond the original Commission proposal. And one of the big things that the European Parliament is looking at is adding in organic chemicals to the mix of products that would be covered by the CBAM. The minute you do that, the amount of U.S. trade that could potentially be caught up in the CBAM expands exponentially. So if chemicals are included, and it makes sense to include them, you will see, I think, a much stronger reaction from the United States. But again, at its core, what this also has the potential to do is to encourage everyone else to think about whether or not some form of carbon pricing should be part of their mix, whether that's an ETS system, whether that's a border adjustment mechanism, whether that is in some way in the mix where we end up with carbon pricing. But I only say it as one of those areas where there is a great potential to come together, and at the same time, a great potential for disagreements. The second one is the area of subsidies. Already, there is a huge concern, as even part of the green steel deal, that immediately U.S. steel producers are going to say, oh, but the European Union gave out subsidies to its steel producers, and therefore we need to impose countervailing duties to offset the subsidies that were granted to the European steel producers in order for those steel producers to become more green. This is not a hypothetical issue. This is already sort of out there and on the table as a huge, source of conflict. And yet, this is also an area in which there ought to be a great ability to coordinate and to take away some of these divergences. Right now, we see ourselves postulated in a very different place. The European Union right now generally invests nearly 10 times the level that the United States invests in zero carbon energy subsidies. So just from a pure, again, math standpoint, we're in a very different place. The European Union is moving much farther, much faster to support its renewable energy. And let's be very clear, renewable energy is the linchpin of green steel. You cannot produce green steel or green aluminum or green glass or green cement without green energy. It cannot be done because those are obviously energy intensive industries. So again, this is one of the key places. Nonetheless, we have a great potential because there is a significant amount of effort in the United States on green technology. And the other place where I think we need to worry about subsidies and where they play in it is fossil fuel subsidies. Again, and here's where there is a fairly significant divergence in the size of the US's continuing subsidies on the fossil fuel side, again, are much larger than the level of the European subsidies for fossil fuels. And the last area in the climate change space that I think, again, is one of the huge potentials is in technology transfer. Because there is no doubt that both the United States and the European Union are at the threshold of developing a lot of the green technologies around steel, around alumina, around carbon capture and storage, around a huge array of what we are all going to need to be sharing and doing in the climate change area. And yet we see these impediments to an immediate and scaling up of the amount of technology transfers that are occurring. We have everything from intellectual property rules to financing, where a huge amount of the green financing money that's available is available to only finance that which is already green. In other words, we do have significant pools of private capital that are ready to go into wind and solar and hydro. There is not the significant level and coordination and agreement on when is it green finance if what it's going into is a dirty coal-fired steel plant and what you're trying to do is decarbonize. But that is where we're getting into huge disagreements over whether or not that is a green investment that falls within any kind of agreed upon parameters of what constitutes green investment. We also see clear issues around how we regulate technology transfer, and again, the degree and need for subsidies to encourage those degrees of technology transfer. But all three of these issues, carbon pricing, subsidies, and technology transfer, are going to be critical to this ability to scale up our ability to fight climate change. And they are the areas in which there is just major opportunities for the United States and the European Union to get on the same page, to coordinate our efforts, to not fight each other, and instead to work together. I am hopeful that this is one of the high priority items for the Trade and Technology Council, or if not, that it will soon become one. I am, again, a little concerned that the climate change pillar of the TTC has not made the progress that I think we all need it to do, but I still hold it out as the place in which our shared value is tremendous. The level of shared commitment and the need for leadership from the United States and the EU on climate change cannot be overstated. And so I am going to remain hopeful that this is one of the areas where U.S. EU transatlantic leadership in the fight against climate change can help us do that scaling up and speeding up that we need to do.
Thank you, Jennifer. On a hopeful note, over to Dan Price.
Peter, thank you very much for including me. We seem to have lost Daniel from our screen, but Daniel, I wanted to give you regards from Michael Smart, whose place I am taking because he was unavailable. And for those of you who may be less familiar with Daniel, there is no more devoted individual in the European Parliament to transatlantic relations. Daniel has been a tremendous leader for many years, and it's wonderful that you could join us here today. You know, Peter, the title of this panel is Values in Transatlantic Relations. And I recall in 2007, when I joined the Bush administration as Sherpa and took over the chairmanship of something then called the TEC, the Transatlantic Economic Council. I gave a speech about transatlantic values and our shared values, and how, given our common values, how much we ought to be able to accomplish. Okay, I think it was Bill who identified that that particular TEC, while it was good on non-GAAP reconciliation of IFRS and a few other deliverables, did founder on an agricultural issue, which Bill identified. But I went back and I looked, and every White House since 2007, with perhaps the possible exception during the Trump years, made the same or similar speech about shared values and about the size of the U.S. EU marketplace and how much we could do if only we could work together. But as we look back over that span of time, what has become clear is we're much better at working together when we face a common enemy or a common crisis than when we are working for the common good. And we need to change that. We need to change that. As it happens, we are facing at least two crises: Russian invasion of Ukraine, COVID and COVID recovery. We might say 2.5 if you throw in a kind of real and sober look at the challenges posed by China. But it's time we put meat on the bones of our transatlantic cooperation. And I applaud the creation of the TTC. I'll come on to a moment as to whether the first T, that is trade, is really there. But I applaud the creation of this. I share Daniel's view that all things being equal, it would be great to resurrect the TTIP with a heavy chunk on regulatory cooperation, aiming towards mutual recognition, if not convergence. I realize that aspiration is difficult to achieve under present circumstances, but there are other things that we can do. A number of them have been mentioned: critical minerals supply chains, EV and clean tech cooperation, as well as working together on the semiconductor ecosystem. But, and here I share Bill's view of what does working together mean? What does cooperation mean? What are the outcomes? Do we really have sufficient projects of scale and gravitational pull for the private sector? Pre-commercial R&D on battery technology, dealing with both storage and end-of-life issues. The people around this table can no doubt think of other ones. Are we prepared to insist that our private sectors share the information on supply and demand in semiconductors and other critical inputs that will make an early warning system possible, as we now have with food commodities? Still open for debate, and we will see what the TTC comes up with. My point is, yes, we have made some progress, but not enough. And it's not enough to coordinate. We must also do. And here, let me say a word about the trade of the Trade and Technology Council, because it is frankly little in evidence, and that's not the EU's fault. And here I commend the EU for pushing forward on trade talks with Indonesia. And I hope, Daniel, that you and your colleagues can awaken the atrophied trade negotiating muscles of the United States. Because frankly, at the moment, the United States does not have a trade policy. It has a trade slogan, worker-centric. But I've yet to meet workers who do not have employers. So perhaps negotiating binding trade and investment rules that permit both companies and their employees to flourish should not be consigned to the ash heap of history or denigrated as 20th century tools. The Biden administration should be admired and praised for fulfilling its promise in part to revitalize alliances, but that promise will remain unfulfilled unless and until the US also has an affirmative trade policy with Europe and Asia. Not just one defined by what we won't do, but one defined by what we will do. I'm going to pause there and turn to, because I wanted these remarks to be somewhat balanced, Daniel, to identify something on the EU agenda that I think is quite concerning, at least for the US private sector. And that is the Directive on Corporate Responsibility Due Diligence. You're smiling, you know, that was adopted by the Commission on February 23rd. For those of you who are not familiar with this, it would apply to any company anywhere located. That is to say, it is extraterritorial, as long as a company generates 150 million euros in turnover from the EU. This would require companies to identify, prevent, mitigate, or correct, quote, actual or potential adverse human rights impacts and adverse environmental impacts, close quote, which are defined as impacts resulting from violations of a long list of international conventions listed in the annex. Now, bear in mind, these are UN conventions, other multilateral conventions that bind states, not companies. And so what's supposed to happen? Each member state is supposed to enact legislation designating an enforcing authority that can investigate on its own accord or at the instance of a private party, that can impose sanctions based on turnover and create private rights of action in its courts against directors and officers for personal liability. It's as breathtaking in scope as it is undefined. So, Bill, to your point that we've had differences in regulatory approaches, here's one that I just wanted to put on the agenda so that my remarks were not viewed as simply critical of the United States alone. I'll stop there. Daniel, a great pleasure to see you.
Thank you, Dan. Let me kick it off with a general question, which is, when we think about US and European values and the ambition to try to bring trade policy to bear to advance those values, I want to ask each of the speakers, is the main problem that our values are not close enough, or is it rather that the institutions and policies and structures available to translate those values through trade policy into concrete results are the problem? In other words, are WTO rules just too outdated to allow the EU and the US to advance their common values through trade policy? Or is the U.S. EU Trade and Technology Council, does it have the wrong agenda? So what is really what is the issue? Is it we don't have the same values, or we don't have the same sort of avenues for actually turning those values through trade policy into something? Anyone want to jump in on that? Bill, I'm sort of looking at you. I'm looking at you. That is true.
I think we should ask them. As you were asking the question, my answer, I was thinking probably both. I mean, it depends a little bit on what you mean by how we are defining value in this conversation. If your values are democracy, free speech, rule of law, then we share all those values, I think. And one of the reasons this cooperation has such potential is because we share those values. When you go down from 40,000 meters to 10,000 meters, it becomes a little more complicated. And a lot of it is how do we, I think where we disagree is how do we implement the values that we share? China being a good example. I think that, the US, as I said in my comments, the US approach and the European approach to China have not been the same. We could have probably a very long discussion about why that's so, but I think there's probably a perception of some unity about the nature of the problem, but we don't agree entirely on how to deal with it. I think likewise on regulatory issues, and the environment is probably a good example. We share the value of climate mitigation. I guess greenhouse gas mitigation would be a better term. We share the goal, but we're having trouble agreeing on how to proceed. One of the things that would be helpful, I think, is if we can both get beyond our tendency towards unilateralism. And that's one of the problems here. There's been a tendency, I think, on both sides for us. Certainly, the Biden administration has exhibited this in the national security area. Is simply we go ahead and do what we want to do, and then we talk to you about it. And certainly in the regulatory space, digital being the best example, Europe goes ahead and does what it wants to do, and then sort of hands us the result. I used to say, this is about consultation, and when I worked on Capitol Hill for a long time, one of the things I learned is there are inevitably differences about what that means, how you consult with each other. In the United States, to the Congress, consultation means the executive comes in and says, we don't know what to do. Tell us what to do. to the executive, consultation means we give you an hour's advance notice on our decision about what we're going to do. I think we have this problem a little bit with Europe. We each go about doing what we want to do and somewhat belatedly start talking to the other side about why we're doing it. And now, and why it's important for them to agree with us and do it our way. The better process is the reverse, where before we decide what to do, we get together and try to figure out ways to do it in tandem. That's sort of the idea of the TTC, by the way, which was to focus on areas where we don't have established divergent paths and to try see if we can work collaboratively on areas that are not already set in concrete, the iron rice bowls of trade. We'll see how that turns out, but I think that's a significant part of the problem.
Daniel Caspary, would you like to offer any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a very good question, because always when we talk about the question of values and how can we deliver values to other countries by trade, first of all, I see many member states of the European Union who are today member states who haven't been the 6 founding member states. And I think they were attracted by our social market economy we had in the 6 founding countries of the European Union. Of course, many citizens were attracted by that. And where the government let the people decide, the people decided in favor of our Western model of democracy, rule of law. And of course, I think that trade could deliver some support for that. And we can see this in the European Union. Or take the situation in Ukraine, where the people in Ukraine, when they had Euromaidan now 10, 15 years ago, it has also something to do that because of trade, because of international relations, they see our ways, our values, they see how we decide, how we live together. And of course, that's quite very attractive. But on the other hand, if a government is totally against, and I think that was one of the biggest misunderstanding of the China accession to the WTO. When you look back, and I read the minutes of our plenary meetings 15 years ago, when I already was a member, and we discussed about the WTO accession of China. And many speakers and also the representative of the European Commission said that by the accession of the WTO, by gaining more trade, we will deliver also our values to China. So, and I think trade can play a role, but you shouldn't, on the one hand, overestimate the role, and on the other hand, if the government strictly is against, it can't deliver. But that is again a chance we have on both sides of the Atlantic. If in this time, where now many countries are looking, who are the good guys? Do we then open windows of opportunity? Do we open windows for partnership? And what can we, for instance, deliver to countries in South Asia who are, of course, in the Chinese hemisphere in a way, but on the other hand, they know they don't want to become too dependent on China. They are looking for other partners. They perhaps are looking for other ways of how to run a country and how to run a society. And there, I definitely think we should deliver some offers. And if you allow, then the CSRD directive we have on our radar screen. We are not happy as EPP Group what the European Commission proposed, but the majorities in the European Parliament are quite clear. But the only thing, perhaps as a citizens of the United States of America, you should not complain about the extraterritorial aspect of a legislation. I think that's something we did copy and paste, perhaps from the other side of the Atlantic. And Jennifer, I was very surprised how positively you are speaking about the CBAM, as we are having tough debates about CBAM in the European Parliament still ongoing. And for instance, in the Committee of International Trade, we had a majority against CBAM because we also see the negative implications on trade. We see that CBAM will lead to higher costs, and that may lead that companies even, let's say, speed up relocating out of the European Union, and therefore this it is still ongoing. And as you are aware, we are negotiating this in a big package, Fit for 55, which we want to decide later this year. But for me, it was very interesting listening your enthusiastic argumentation on CBAM because let's say it this way, I'm not in the 100% against camp, but I'm in the I'm having deep concerns camp.
Jennifer?
Well, I'll only say, I mean, obviously part of my enthusiasm is really my conviction that unless the European Union or someone pushes the rest of the world, I really fear that we're not going to move far enough, fast enough on climate change. So some of it is to just say, I think the European Union has done a very important thing for the world by pushing this issue and by being very clear about where you're coming out on climate change. Obviously, I think within the European Union, the significant concern now is when you impose, to me, the part of the reason why there is so much debate is inherent in the notion of going ahead with the CBAM is the phasing out of the free allowances. And again, obviously, to me, that is where you are seeing a lot of pushback. Now, my understanding is a lot of the European companies that initially were quite in favor of CBAM, now as they see the potential ending of their free allowances, they're having very serious sort of second thoughts about it. But to me, where we have to get is where companies, not just within the European Union, but many of the companies among your trading partners have got to see the idea of climate change as coming somewhere within the area of a level playing field, where you are not being penalized by being located in a country that has very strict carbon controls, because the theory is all of the rest of the world does also. So no one is gaining an unfair competitive advantage. And to me, we're not going to get there fast enough by saying everybody else in the world should adopt an ETS or a carbon pricing system. The only way we're going to get there fast enough is if those that are worried about the competitive effects of having a strict climate policy have the ability to put on a border adjustment.
Dan Price.
Just a quick comment on, do we share common values or not? And if we do, why can't we make greater progress? I think we share common values. I don't think that's the issue. The issue is we have different approaches and we have different risk calculuses. I mean, you can see this in the bank-centric financing versus market capitalism. Right? You can see it in the approach towards digital, right? The EU is firmly behind a digital euro, but that's a central bank digital currency, and it doesn't really contemplate coexistence with privately issued stablecoin. The UK and the United States do. And again, this is a difference of approach, of risk appetites. It's also a difference in perspective on what is the appropriate sphere of governmental activity, what is the appropriate sphere of private sector activity, and what is the relationship between the private sector and the government. And we're going to have different approaches, we're going to have different perspectives. But that doesn't mean that we should not be able to achieve common goals and common outcomes if we give each other a slight margin of flexibility, so that if we elevate this notion of comparable regulatory outcomes resulting from different regulatory schemes. And I think this kind of cuts across finance, it cuts across tech, it cuts across food safety and product safety. And I would hope that one of the important areas that the TTC would take up is this development of a taxonomy for what is a comparable regulatory outcome, justifying then cross-border flows of the particular good or service.
Can I?
Yeah.
I'm only going to add one sort of comment, which slightly goes to your question that involved this issue of whether the WTO rules are too outdated to come to common values. Because I think it is important for us to all step back and think about when the TTIP was under discussion. It was very clear that the hardcore economic value and the driver of that agreement was not about tariffs or market access from that tariff perspective. I mean, yes, there were tariff cuts that would have come if we'd had a TTIP. And that is a lot of the hardcore of the WTO rules are around non-discrimination, again, MFN and national treatment around tariffs and trade in goods. And what became very clear in the TTIP and is even more clear now is where the real gains are in the trade arena are not around tariffs and traditional market access. They're around regulatory cooperation. And for all the reasons that Dan and Bill have stated, those are much harder. I mean, it's just simply flat out much harder. And yet that's where the real value drive is. That is where you could really gain efficiencies. If we did not have to have cars doubly inspected on both sides of the Atlantic, we didn't have different standards so that some companies had to produce to one standard and other companies have to produce to another standard. That's the inefficiencies and the waste in the trade between the United States and the European Union. But as for all the reasons we've said, that's what's really hard. And that is where the WTO rules don't even speak to it. So again, other than, again, technical barriers to trade, which again stems from only these kind of non-discrimination principles, the WTO rules are, I'm not going to say they're non-existent. We have a technical barriers to trade agreement, but where the WTO rules do not go as far as we need to go in order to get this kind of regulatory compliance, which is where the real benefits are to be gained.
Just one thought, since we're raising the ghost of TTIP, I mean, there's also the third chapter of TTIP, which was on sort of global trade rules. And when you talked about level playing field issue, Jennifer, relating to climate, I mean, I think that's also something that's absent. And that when you talk about values, I think some of the things, the third chapter of TTIP on global trade rules was aiming to do would also be a way to advance common values, particularly given the sort of more diverse trading system we have with the rise of China and other factors. Anyway, enough from me. I'd like to open it up to everyone here if they'd like to follow up either on what has been said.
Detlef Brown's German embassy. I just wanted to pick up what you said, and what it was also raised by Bill Reinsch, basically. I would add another point. Why haven't we been successful in tech, in TEP, in everything that we have done over the last 20 years? And it's coming to the fore now. And I would call it, aren't there things like, and I'm provoking, things like cultural differences between the two sides of the Atlantic? The issue of risk-taking. Well, we in Europe, we have a different attitude. We are maybe a little bit more risk-averse, right? That's why we are very dearly attached to the precautionary principle in regulation. And I think this has been, you must have met these issues in your negotiations 10, 15 years ago, or many times.
And every year since.
Okay. And I just wanted to conclude on that by saying the only way you can overcome that, you will not change the cultural differences, our attachments to different values. And there is a difference in values. The only thing how we can get out of that is by finding a sort of mutual recognition to recognize the approach of the other side. And giving flexibility. You called it flexibility. I would say this approach, like mutual recognition of our different approaches. I think that's the only way you can find out, where you can get out of that.
Anyone like to comment on that, or Dan, did you want to comment on his?
I agree. I think we were saying the same thing in different words. Yep. I wonder if Daniel has a comment on the viability of mutual recognition across a range of topics, or if you think the divisions are too great.
So I'm not quite sure if I got the question correctly, as I really had audio problems, but this mutual recognition, I think it was one of the issues where there are most of concerns in theory, but in practice, I think we should be able to overcome them. Perhaps we shouldn't do it in all sectors first. That was perhaps, I think, a mistake we did during the TTIP. But if we, let's say, find a way to balance, of course, out the different interests in the industrial sectors, but imagine we do a kind of mutual recognition on industrial goods, but we don't do it on food. I know this is, of course, a position which is not acceptable for the United States, but I think we perhaps should also in this area try to find a step-by-step approach on the one hand, and on the other hand, that is what I said, why I'm convinced we need more cooperation of the parliaments on both sides of the Atlantic. Because all things we are talking about, we try to remove barriers which came up during the last years. And if we could really build up a joint parliamentary assembly, think about now, or I have to restart, sorry, take the Transatlantic Legislators Dialogue today. There are 10 members of the European Parliament and 10 members of the US Congress, and they meet 2 or 3 times a year. It's nice, they visit, they do joint visits, but they don't talk about concrete legislation and concrete standards and concrete projects. And what I think would help us if legislators on both sides of the Atlantic regularly meet, perhaps in a kind of combination of parliamentary committees, that if you have a big environmental legislation in the United States ongoing, and we have the same on the European side, we should bring our members of those committees together to see if they can find a common ground or if they find complementary legislation. And that then may lead to a situation that we also could have this acceptance of standards which are perhaps different, but which may better fit together. And therefore, I think what we need is not only this political approach, how to remove barriers which came up during the last years, but what we need is we need a more aggressive way to avoid different standards and new barriers to come up, because legislators are not talking often enough with each other. So the administrations can do a lot, but I think if this also comes from parliaments, that may help. So I know it's not a perfect answer to the question, but we should think how to avoid regulatory standards which don't fit to each other in a better way.
Yeah, and just, Daniel, I agree completely. And just for those of you who may think that, well, we can't do mutual recognition in really sensitive areas, we've done it on pharmaceutical plant inspections, so that a plant inspected by the European Medicines Agency does not need to be inspected by the FDA and vice versa. We've done it on vaccine batch testing. And without that mutual recognition, our response to COVID would have looked very different. So this is a promising underexplored area, in my view.
Bill, did you have a comment?
No, let's go on to them if there's more questions.
Okay, yes.
Thank you very much. Paul Rennie from the British Embassy. The question really about values and trade for me is interesting, because when we get into discussions about trade between big partners, we find lots of reasons why our values don't seem to align. And I think miss the fact that there's probably far more Europeans and Americans looking at things like the Russian invasion of Ukraine would say our values are actually very aligned. And Jennifer's point about climate change being one of them, but there's a lot of other trading partners out there who are probably very significantly removed from the core of what I think European and US values would look like. The two questions I have for the panelists linked to that are number one, what do you think are the limits of trade to push a values agenda? Because we link the two of them here, but ultimately there's probably limits, as we've seen with WTO membership for some countries. And the second question, I guess, not least in the context of the kind of cost of living issues right now, but other things in America is what's the kind of inflection point between sort of dollars and values for the US? So at what point do you think the pain is felt around compromising on values for trade or vice versa? And I say that in the context that I think that probably is irrespective of administration, because it feels to me the central lobby groups and business groups and other advocates in the US probably have a sort of pain point that transcends the government in power. Is that not the right way of looking at how the trade lobby system works with US thinking? Thanks.
Great questions. Anyone like to, Jeff?
Well, I'll start on your first one, just a little bit of the limits of trade to push a values agenda. Obviously, in the past, I think it's been quite limited. I mean, again, I think if you look at a lot of the things that were said on the US side about what would come of China's accession to the WTO. I actually wrote an article and had reason to go back and reread all of those documents. And it was everything from it's going to solve the problem with nuclear missiles in North Korea to it's going to solve the problems with Taiwan to, on and on in terms of everything. Everything was going to get resolved as a result of China's joining the WTO. And then if you look at what the actual agreement is, it's limited to these very, if you will, narrow trade issues. So on the one hand, my sense is trade is just in that sense limited. And on the other hand, if you look at, even just what's happened in the last couple of years, you've now seen, the United States and now joined by Europe and others start to put bans on goods made with forced labor coming out of Xinjiang. So you are starting to see some of those value issues come into the trade arena. To me, the limit is because we have been, to the extent that we link the two, we have been better about using trade as a stick, putting on tariffs, putting on quotas, putting on bans for products that we don't like traded for whatever the value is. What we have not done a very good job is trying to figure out how to use trade as a carrot. I mean, how do you privilege? How do you create a fast lane for good trade, for good values issues. And the second part of the limits is that we are good at using these sticks when it's a trade in a good, again, when it's a physical good. And we have to acknowledge that, a significant amount of the trade agenda covers trade in services, the movement of capital, the movement of people, and the movement of services. None of those, I think, very easily carry either the carrots or the sticks, certainly not the sticks in the sense of bans or quotas. So I do think there's significant limits to where the trade agenda can link up to values, but that's what's coming. And I think that is obviously inherent in the idea behind a CBAM, inherent in a lot of other things, is to try to put that value of climate change within the actual trading rules. And again, to me, this is where we're going to have to go on climate change, is to try to figure out how do you bring that value into the trade agenda? Because again, we're not going to get to scale or speed fast enough if we can't find a way to do that.
Yes, Bill.
I think that's a good point. I used to give speeches about how the two areas really needed to be separate in the sense that if you overloaded a trade agreement with a values-based agenda, you were not likely to get a trade agreement because you were going to try to get force countries to do things that fundamentally they were unwilling to do for cultural reasons or political reasons. I think there's still something to that, but one of the things that's happened particularly recently is, and the war is a good illustration of this, things are a lot more visible now than they used to be. And they're really visible because of these more than anything else. So in the case of the war, you've got people wandering around in Ukrainian villages taking pictures of dead bodies and exploded buildings. And you can see what is happening in real time. And it all goes viral worldwide, maybe not in Russia, but for the most part worldwide. Likewise, forced labor becomes an issue because you've got activists who are out there having some success identifying, because of people on the ground with cameras taking pictures, identifying when this occurs and identifying places and locations and the names of companies where this is happening. 5 or 10 years ago, you couldn't do that. That just wasn't happening. Now that it's visible, what that means is you've got, particularly for the consumer-facing sector of trade, you've got consumer pressures, and you've got more and more people, I wouldn't say a majority, but more and more people saying, I want to make sure that my product, what I'm buying, is not made with forced labor, for example. And that then forces companies to take positions. I mean, you saw this in the war. There's a lot of pressure on companies say, you've got to get out of Russia. We're not going to do business with you if you don't. So that's imposing a value on trade. And I think it's really because of the way technology has transformed the nature of trade. The other thing I'd just add, we have a kind of a slightly different debate here that's going on right now that really irritates me, frankly, which is, and you see it a little bit in the IPEF. First of all, the administration on the carrot and stick issue, the administration, this is a good illustration. The IPEF is a good illustration because basically, as Dan said, the administration has taken all the carrots off the table in the beginning. So it'll be interesting to see how a proposed agreement where the best we can offer is we won't do anything more bad to you if you sign up. How far that's going to get, that remains to be seen. But the other issue we're getting into now, which has frustrated me in the past, is what is the point of the negotiation in the first place? Because we've got a growing number of people here on the left in the Democratic Party, and I'm a member of the Democratic Party, so I guess I can criticize my own folks saying, we're not going to talk to you if your standards are not where we think they ought to be. You probably saw the report of the USTR's Labor Advisory Committee that recommended that we not negotiate in the IPEF with, 7 of the 10 ASEAN nations, whatever it was, because our labor standards are not up to par. Historically, I think the thought was the reverse. If you don't like their standards, you negotiate with them so that you can get them to agree to better standards. If you say up front, we're not going to talk to you unless your behavior is acceptable from our point of view, it's probably not a successful route to follow as far as negotiations are concerned. The administration hasn't entirely bought into that in this case, but it makes the debate, I think, a lot more complicated. If it's one thing to inject values into saying we are going to strive to get our trading partners to improve their standards and this and this and this and this and this. That's one approach. If the opposite approach is we're not going to negotiate with you unless you are already where we want you to be, I think that's a recipe for producing very few agreements going forward. Finally, if I can go back, I think that was exactly right on the risk issue. I think there's a real difference in risk evaluation between Europe and the United States. And you can see it plays out in the economy, and it plays out in the extent to which economies are innovative. And it plays out in the way our capital market's structured. So I think it's a big difference. And that's probably why it makes it hard for us to get over some of these things.
When I listened to what you, Jennifer, and you, Bill, said in response to that question, it seems as if while the values were sort of implicit when the WTO was negotiated, it sounds like there's pressure to have those values be explicit now, which of course is a lot harder, but it sounds like we may not be able to go back to where we were on that issue. Daniel Caspary, would you like to add any closing remarks?
It's difficult to make, first of all, those remarks from remote, but secondly, I think we all realize we have a lot of common projects we should realize. I think we also that no one expected that Putin really did what he did. And that therefore, I think the need to do more transatlantic cooperation and more transatlantic project is obvious and clear. We face the same future obstacles like the developments of within China, within the whole Asian region, and there aren't so many partners who are like-minded, and therefore I think we know what is the role we have to play. We know what the results are we have to deliver, and I hope that we are able to use this window of opportunity which we have on both sides of the Atlantic, having Ursula von der Leyen as President of the European Commission and having Joe Biden as President of the United States. And I think on that basis, I can only ask all of us, use your networks and use your lines to make sure that we are able to deliver within the next 2 years. And let's use this, I call it Kiev momentum, which I think can be seen on both sides of the Atlantic. So let's use it.
Well, with that positive note, just remains to thank all of you for coming. I'd like to thank my speakers, Daniel Caspary joining us virtually, Jennifer Hillman, Dan Price, and Bill Reinsch. Let me also thank the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung again for their cooperation. And we look forward to reconvening Transatlantic Trade Week for a third time next year. Thank you,
Thank you.
everyone.